The freezing autumn wind lashing off the Hudson River carried the sharp, unforgiving bite of impending winter. But the true, suffocating cold awaited inside the Palazzo d'Oro. Elena stepped out of the heavy, blacked-out transport, her low heels clicking softly against the pristine white marble of the grand exterior staircase. She wrapped her ivory cashmere shawl tighter around her shoulders, a fragile, soft barrier against both the plunging temperature and the overwhelming weight of the night ahead. Beneath the woven wool, her hands instinctively moved to rest over the distinct, heavy curve of her 6-month pregnant belly. She took a slow, carefully measured breath. The icy air burned her lungs, a sharp reminder that she was entirely out of her depth, stepping out of the shadows into a world that viewed her very existence as an unforgivable flaw in their perfect lineage. The massive oak doors swung inward, pulled open by silent, heavily armed guards dressed in tailored evening wear. Immediately, a wave of suffocating warmth washed over her, carrying the dense, intoxicating scents of crushed black orchids, imported amber and vintage champagne. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of old-world intimidation. Massive baccarat crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted, gold-leaf ceilings, casting fractured, razor-sharp light across a sprawling sea of elite syndicate members. This was not merely a charity gala. It was a gathering of the city's most lethal predators, draped in bespoke Italian wool and flowing, priceless haute couture. Elena stood at the edge of the descending staircase, her simple emerald silk dress standing in stark, isolating contrast to the millions of dollars in diamonds glittering on the floor below her. She felt like a civilian wandering into a war zone, completely devoid of armor. Her former life as a financial auditor had trained her to look past the superficial surface of numbers, to find the hidden ledgers of deceit, leverage, and raw power. Now, her hyper-vigilant cognitive loops applied that exact same tradecraft to the ballroom floor. She did not just see guests laughing over crystal flutes. She mapped the territorial lines of a criminal empire. She noted the precise, calculating micro-expressions of the capos, securing the eastern exits, the rigid, defensive posture of the men standing near the bar, and the subtle, deferential space left entirely empty at the very center of the room. That space was reserved for her fiancé, the absolute ruler of this underground domain, who is currently delayed in a secure, high-level briefing downstairs. For the moment, she was entirely alone in the lion's den. As she descended the final marble steps, the whispers began. They were not subtle. In this echelon of high society, cruelty was a recognized currency, and discretion was reserved only for equals. Eyes tracked her every movement, dissecting her worth. The hostile stares felt like physical weight pressing heavily down on her shoulders, making her chest dangerously tight. She navigated the edge of the room, keeping her gaze forward and her posture perfectly straight. She refused to give the elite crowd the satisfaction of a bowed head. Her fingers traced the delicate silver chain resting against her collarbone, finding the modest amethyst pendant her late grandmother had given her. It was the only piece of her humble past she had brought into this gilded fortress. A tiny, grounding anchor of reality in an overwhelming sea of excess. A waiter in pristine white gloves offered her a glass of sparkling water. She took it with a quiet murmur of thanks, hoping the freezing condensation against her skin would ground her racing pulse. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her throat, the biological terror of a hunted animal trying to maintain composure. Then, the ambient noise in her immediate vicinity abruptly died. The classical string quartet playing in the upper gallery seemed to fade into a hollow, distant echo as the crowd parted like a severed artery. The temperature around Elena plummeted, the fine hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as a new shadow fell over her. Cassandra stepped into the clearing, dripping in aristocratic arrogance and heavy, blinding heirloom diamonds. The matriarch wore a structured midnight blue velvet gown that swept the floor with ominous grace, her posture rigid with generations of unchecked authority. Her eyes, sharp, calculating, and completely devoid of human warmth, locked directly onto the expectant mother. Flanking the older woman was Marcus. The younger cousin adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, a slick, greedy smile playing on his lips. He reeked of expensive cologne and corporate entitlement, his gaze dragging up and down Elena's simple attire, with naked, theatrical disgust. They did not simply walk toward her. They executed a calculated, tactical maneuver, stepping precisely to block her only path to the side exits. The crowd of elite onlookers naturally closed in behind them, forming a tight, suffocating ring of spectators eager for blood. The elegant trap was set. I must say, Cassandra's voice cut through the heavy silence. It was not a hushed whisper. It was a perfectly projected, carrying tone designed for maximum public execution. I am absolutely astonished the security detail allowed you through the front doors. I naturally assumed the staff maintained a separate service entrance for their evening entertainment. Elena's spine stiffened. She kept her chin level, her analytical mind immediately calculating the social damage, processing the public threat radiating from the older woman. "Good evening, Cassandra," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the sudden, terrifying drop in her stomach. "Do not address me with such insolent familiarity," the matriarch snapped, taking a predatory step closer. The scent of her heavy, cloying perfume invaded Elena's personal space, thick and suffocating. "Did you truly believe a cheap emerald slip would mask what you actually are? A temporary distraction, a tragic miscalculation." Marcus let out a low, mocking laugh. He stepped forward, his eyes landing deliberately on her chest. "And look at that pathetic jewelry," he sneered, gesturing toward her neck with his crystal tumbler. "An amethyst pendant? My God, it looks like something pulled from a pawn shop window in the slums. Is that the ultimate price tag of your dignity, little auditor? Or just a desperate, laughable attempt to pretend you belong in our world?" Elena's knuckles turned bone white as she gripped her ivory shawl. She refused to let her voice tremble, though a cold, terrified sweat was already tracing its way down her spine. "My dignity is not measured by the weight of stolen diamonds, Marcus. That is a concept I would not expect a man who embezzles from his own family's shell companies to ever understand." The cousin's slick smile vanished instantly. A flash of genuine, ugly panic crossed his features, quickly twisting into a violent, dark rage as a shocked murmur rippled through the surrounding aristocratic crowd. But Cassandra did not let the intellectual counterattack stand. The matriarch's face twisted into a rigid mask of pure, unadulterated venom. She closed the final distance between them, her ruthless gaze dropping deliberately from Elena's face down to her swollen abdomen. "You think your little financial tricks make you clever?" Cassandra hissed, her voice rising in volume, ensuring every single aristocrat in the grand ballroom heard the devastating accusation. "You are nothing but a low-class opportunist, clinging desperately to our bloodline, a parasite draining our resources. And we all know exactly what you are carrying." Elena's breathing halted entirely. The massive room seemed to violently tilt on its axis. Cassandra pointed a manicured, diamond-clad finger directly at the pregnant curve beneath the silk. "Do you honestly expect us to believe that child belongs to the king of this city? A stray from the blue-collar gutters, suddenly claiming to carry the syndicate's sole heir? It is a bastard calculation, a pathetic, filthy lie engineered to secure a permanent trust fund." The sheer, public cruelty of the words struck Elena with the concussive force of a physical blow. The ambient light of the crystal chandeliers flared blindingly bright in her vision. A sharp, localized cramp seized her lower back, a violent somatic reaction to the overwhelming spike of adrenaline and sheer, paralyzing terror. Her knees threatened to buckle against the cold marble floor. She wrapped both of her trembling arms protectively around her unborn child, her lungs desperately fighting for a single breath of air in a room that had suddenly run completely out of oxygen. Elena forced her lungs to expand, pushing through the suffocating lack of oxygen. The stabbing pain in her lower back radiated outward, a harsh biological warning that her body was reaching its absolute limit under the crushing weight of the social execution. She locked her jaw, refusing to break eye contact with the older woman. Her hyper-vigilant mind scrambled for traction, analyzing the sheer hostility in the matriarch's rigid postures and the greedy anticipation radiating from the surrounding guests. "I do not want a single cent of your inherited trust funds, Cassandra," Elena stated, her voice remarkably clear. It cut through the dense, perfume-laden air with the precision of a scalpel. "I have survived on my own intellect and my own labor my entire life. My child is not a negotiation tactic. Nor is it a piece of corporate leverage to be traded among your corrupt board members. This baby is the direct bloodline of the man who built the very empire you are standing in. Cassandra let out a low, brittle laugh that carried the chilling resonance of shattering glass. She adjusted the heavy diamond collar around her neck, her expression twisting into a mask of aristocratic pity. An auditor speaking of empires, the older woman mocked, projecting her voice so the elite circle could savor every syllable. How utterly quaint. Do you genuinely believe that balancing a few hidden ledgers makes you a sovereign? It simply makes you the hired help. And the hired help, my dear, does not sit on the throne. Marcus took another deliberate step forward, aggressively encroaching on Elena's already shrinking personal space. The cloying scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sour, metallic tang of his underlying arrogance. You are nothing but a temporary distraction, the cousin sneered, leaning down to hiss the words directly into her face. A paper wife. A passing amusement for a man who gets bored easily. The moment he realizes you are a liability, he will take the kid and leave you rotting back in the blue-collar gutter, where you belong. The psychological assault was relentless. The aristocratic predators smelled blood in the water. The surrounding crowd began to murmur in agreement, their hostile whispers compounding into a deafening, localized roar inside her head. She had spent years auditing fraudulent corporate accounts and tracking millions of dollars through phantom shell companies, but none of that intellectual armor could protect her from the sheer biological vulnerability of carrying a child under extreme duress. The heavy gold leaf ceiling seemed to physically lower, pressing the remaining oxygen out of the massive room. The sheer physiological demand of entering her third trimester, combined with the catastrophic spike of adrenaline, finally overloaded her nervous system. A severe localized cramp seized her abdomen. It was a violent contraction triggered entirely by extreme psychological distress. A hot, involuntary tear spilled over her dark lashes. It traced a slow, agonizing path down her pale skin, capturing the fractured light of the crystal chandeliers, before dropping onto the emerald silk of her dress. It was not a tear of surrender, but a raw, physical manifestation of profound exhaustion and deep-seated, public humiliation. She raised a trembling hand to wipe it away, but her fingers shook so violently she couldn't complete the motion. Another sharp cramp tore through her lower spine. Her legs, which had held her up through years of grueling corporate survival, finally betrayed her. Her low heels slipped against the polished marble floor. Her knees buckled. She didn't collapse entirely. She managed to catch herself on the edge of a heavy velvet-draped cocktail table. Her knuckles turned bone white as she fought desperately to keep her body upright. She wrapped her other arm tightly around her swollen stomach, curling inward in a primal, protective shield. She hung her head, the quiet sound of her own ragged, weeping breaths entirely drowned out by the smug, victorious silence of the high society elite watching her break. Then, the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom were violently breached. The sound of the reinforced wood slamming against the marble walls echoed like a concussive blast, tearing the brass hinges completely from their mountings. The massive baccarat crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling rattled violently, throwing chaotic shards of light across the sudden, absolute silence. In the upper balcony, the classical string quartet ceased playing instantly. A single, discordant screech of a cello bow cut through the air before dying into nothingness. Vittorio Moretti stood in the threshold. The absolute, cold-blooded ruler of the city's premier syndicate did not merely enter the room. He eclipsed it. Dressed in a bespoke, pitch-black Brioni suit that seemed to absorb the ambient light around him, he radiated a terrifying, liquid nitrogen rage. He smelled of freezing rain, expensive sandalwood, and the distinct metallic tang of cordite. His massive, imposing frame cast a long, lethal shadow across the floor. For a fraction of a second, he stood perfectly still, his dark, calculating eyes sweeping the sprawling space to register the tactical layout. Flanking him was Leo Scaletta, the Don's silent, highly efficient personal bodyguard. Leo did not wait for a verbal command. With a sharp, clinical hand gesture, he deployed a dozen heavily armed enforcers into the opulent space. The contrast was staggering. Men forged in violence stepping onto floors, meant for waltzes. They moved with lethal, synchronized grace, seamlessly securing every exit and neutralizing the venue's private security detail. The faint, unmistakable click of tactical holsters being unsnapped echoed off the gold leaf walls. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet to absolute zero. The elite crowd, so arrogant and vocal a moment before, shrank back in profound, visceral terror. Aristocrats who had just been laughing spilled vintage champagne onto their expensive shoes, their hands trembling violently. The dense sea of diamonds and haute couture parted instantly, desperate to clear a wide, unobstructed path for the dawn. Vittorio's gaze locked onto the center of the room. He bypassed the terrified guests. He saw the tight, hostile ring of his own relatives. He registered his mother's rigid, suddenly pale posture. He noted his cousin's slick, cowardly smile dissolving into a mask of genuine, suffocating panic. And then, his eyes found Elena. He saw the wet tear tracks staining her pale cheeks. He saw her fragile, shivering frame leaning heavily against the velvet table, her knees buckled in physical distress. He saw her arms wrapped desperately around her pregnant belly, curling inward as if trying to shield their unborn child from a pack of ravenous wolves. A micro-expression of pure, unadulterated violence crossed Vittorio's sharply angled face. The sight of his weeping fiancée struck him with a primal, catastrophic force, instantly shattering his legendary composure. The cold strategist vanished, replaced entirely by a lethal protector pushed to the edge of sanity. He moved. He did not run, but his long, purposeful strides devoured the distance with the terrifying, inevitable speed of a hunting leopard. The high society guests scrambled backward, practically climbing over each other to escape his path. "Vittorio, darling," Cassandra attempted to speak. Her voice trembled slightly as she tried to maintain her aristocratic authority against the crushing weight of his presence. "We were simply having a necessary conversation regarding—" Vittorio did not even look at the matriarch. He walked right past her. His broad shoulder brushed against Marcus with enough kinetic force to send the younger cousin stumbling backward in sheer terror, tripping over his own bespoke leather shoes. He reached Elena, his massive hands, rough from years of tactical operations but infinitely gentle with her, instantly wrapped around her trembling shoulders. The sheer contrast between his lethal reputation and the absolute, tender desperation in his touch was staggering. He pulled her upright, lifting her exhausted, crying frame against the structured wool of his suit. He turned his own massive body into an impenetrable barrier between her and the venomous room. He pressed his face into her hair, inhaling the faint, familiar scent of her shampoo, his own heart hammering against his ribs in a rare display of sheer biological panic. "I have you," he whispered against her ear. The hushed words meant only for her. "I have you. You are safe." Then, the Syndicate King slowly turned his head, his eyes now burning with the promise of absolute destruction, locked onto his mother and cousin. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy it felt like physical pressure, waiting for the executioner's blade to fall. The heavy silence stretched, suffocating and absolute. Against the bespoke wool of Vittorio's suit, Elena finally allowed her eyes to close. Her terrifying, irregular heartbeat slowly synchronized with the rhythmic, impossibly calm pulse radiating from the man holding her. His right hand, scarred across the knuckles from years of ruthless territorial expansion, slid down the delicate emerald silk covering her spine. He locked his unyielding grip at the base of her waist, becoming a literal pillar of structural support for her exhausted, trembling frame. With his massive left arm, he created an impenetrable physical canopy that shielded her from the venomous stares of the aristocratic room. Tucked gently beneath his chin, she inhaled the freezing scent of winter rain, clinging to his dark overcoat, mixed with the familiar, rich notes of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. It immediately short-circuited her deep biological panic. For the first time since she had stepped out of the armored transport into the hostile gala, the agonizing, stress-induced cramp in her lower back began to release. "Look at me, Vittorio," Cassandra demanded, her voice brittle and desperate. The matriarch fought a losing battle against the terrifying gravitational pull of her son's fury. The heavy heirloom diamonds resting against her collarbone caught the fractured light of the baccarat the fort chandeliers, vibrating violently as her breathing grew shallow. "I was merely correcting a severe lapse in judgment," She is a common auditor. You cannot allow her to manipulate the primary lineage of this syndicate. Quiet. The single syllable dropped into the grand ballroom with crushing density. The ambient temperature seemed to plummet, locking the elite guests in a suffocating freeze. In the periphery of the crowd, a terrified waiter took a blind step backward, his heel catching on a thick velvet drape. A crystal champagne flute slipped from his white-gloved hand, shattering loudly against the pristine white marble floor. The jagged shards of glass sparkled mockingly under the opulent lighting, but nobody dared to breathe. Nobody looked at the broken glass scattered across the stone. Vittorio shifted his stance, planting his bespoke leather boots firmly into the marble. He did not let go of his weeping fiancée. Instead, he pulled her even closer, wrapping his heavily muscled arms securely over the distinct curve of her 6-month pregnant belly in an undeniable primal claim of ownership. When he spoke again, the baritone resonance tore from his chest, a thunderous, lethal decree that reverberated off the gold leaf ceilings and struck the surrounding aristocracy with the weight of physical force. "Nobody can hurt my queen." The absolute declaration hit the elite crowd like a concussive shockwave. High society guests physically recoiled, their arrogant posturing completely shattered. The explicit elevation was staggering. The untouchable Don had not called her his temporary paper wife or a corporate distraction. He had publicly, irrevocably crowned the quiet, brilliant woman in his arms as the undisputed ruler of the city's most terrifying criminal empire. Elena caught her breath, her shivering fingers curling tightly into the dark lapel of his tailored coat. The raw, unadulterated devotion in his voice completely dismantled the last of her emotional armor. Fresh, hot tears spilled over her dark lashes, tracing quiet paths down her pale cheeks. The crushing weight of her public humiliation had vanished entirely. In its place was the profound, terrifying safety of his absolute protection. She leaned her weight entirely against him, letting his lethal reputation carry the heavy burden of her survival. Marcus swallowed hard, the sickening sound audibly clicking in the dead silence of the opulent room. The younger cousin's slick, corporate arrogance had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a pale, trembling coward trapped in a tailored suit. Cold sweat beaded across his forehead, ruining his carefully manicured facade. He took a slow, desperate step backward, frantically trying to fade into the dense wall of elite onlookers. The crowd instantly parted, abandoning him without hesitation. They actively stepped away, leaving the arrogant heir completely exposed and isolated in the center of the sprawling ballroom floor. Vittorio's cold gaze tracked the pathetic movement. His rage solidified into something far more dangerous: calculated, systematic execution. He turned his attention away from his trembling cousin and looked directly at the loyal captain standing a few feet away. His massive hand still rested protectively over Elena's unborn child. "Leo," the Syndicate King commanded, his voice dropping back to a smooth, chilling cadence that promised total ruin. Leo Scaletta stepped forward, the tactical holster strapped to his thigh, serving as a grim reminder of the extreme violence waiting to be unleashed. The enforcer withdrew an encrypted, heavy-duty tablet from the interior pocket of his jacket. His expression remained completely blank, a perfectly trained operative awaiting the final kill order. "Marcus seems to believe he holds significant corporate leverage over this family," Vittorio stated, his predatory eyes never leaving his cousin's terrified face. "Liquidate his offshore holding companies. Target every single Phantom shell account he has been funneling syndicate revenue into through the Panamanian logistics network. I want his entire portfolio zeroed out before I finish speaking." "Vittorio, please!" Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking in sheer, unadulterated panic. The cousin stumbled forward, his knees colliding harshly with the unforgiving marble floor. The sickening thud of bone against stone echoed through the silent ballroom. "You cannot do this. I am blood. I was just trying to protect the family's financial assets from an outsider." "You are nothing," Vittorio interrupted, his tone devoid of a single ounce of mercy. "You publicly insulted the mother of my heir. You exist right now only because I have not yet given the tactical order to erase you from this earth." Leo's thumb swiped rapidly across the glowing screen of the secure tablet, initiating full asset seizure, boss. The Grand Cayman accounts are actively frozen, routing all recovered capital directly into Miss Rostova's private trust. Marcus let out a hollow, suffocating gasp. In less than 20 seconds, the arrogant billionaire heir had been stripped of his entire net worth, reduced to absolute financial ruin on the very floor he had tried to claim as his exclusive domain. His lucrative credit lines snapped shut, and his hidden wealth vanished into the digital ether. He clawed at his bespoke collar, gasping desperately for air, as the devastating reality of his new poverty crushed the breath completely out of his lungs. Cassandra watched her nephew collapse, her rigid aristocratic composure finally shattering. The matriarch took a jerky, uncoordinated step forward, her manicured hands gripping the heavy fabric of her midnight blue velvet gown. "This is absolute madness, Vittorio," she hissed, abandoning all remaining pretense of high society etiquette. "You are destroying your own elite bloodline for a stray. You will paralyze our operations. You cannot simply cut us off from the empire." Vittorio slowly turned his dark, unyielding stare onto his mother. He adjusted his hold on Elena, his thumb gently smoothing over the emerald silk covering her spine, in a quiet, deeply possessive rhythm that grounded the frightened woman against his chest. "You built your entire identity on the fragile illusion of power I allowed you to hold, Cassandra," he said, the icy calm in his voice cutting far deeper than any scream could. "You used my wealth to bully the woman carrying my child. You truly thought I would prioritize archaic protocol over the safety of my own family." He looked back at his silent, waiting enforcer. "Leo, revoke her access to the limitless syndicate credit lines immediately. Sever her signature authority from the primary trust, the European supply networks, and the Palazzo d'Oro's operational accounts." The matriarch physically staggered, as if she had been struck in the chest by a tactical round. The color drained entirely from her perfectly powdered face, leaving her looking fragile, hollow, and remarkably old. Her unrestricted syndicate funding was the ultimate, undisputed symbol of elite impunity in their dark world. It was a limitless financial anchor that granted her untouchable status among the global aristocracy. Without it, she was completely, permanently exiled from the Gilded Kingdom she had ruthlessly ruled for decades. "You cannot do this to me," Cassandra whispered, her voice trembling violently as the sheer magnitude of her sudden exile crashed over her. "I gave you life. I am your mother, and she is my queen." Vittorio replied without a second of hesitation. His hand, bearing the heavy weight of the onyx seal ring, moved up to cup the back of Elena's head, pressing her gently but firmly against his racing heart. "You forgot exactly who built this throne." Leo tapped the encrypted screen one final time. A sharp, digital chime echoed from the device, signaling the absolute execution of the command. The financial and social dismantling was permanently sealed. The elite syndicate members watching from the perimeter held their collective breath, their eyes wide with raw, primal fear. They had just witnessed the ruthless, extrajudicial eradication of two of the most powerful figures in New York's high society, accomplished flawlessly without a single bullet being fired. The intellectual and financial tradecraft of the underworld king had entirely stripped his enemies of their armor, leaving them as nothing more than impoverished ghosts haunting their own opulent gala. Elena kept her face buried deeply in the warm cashmere of his overcoat. She did not look back at the ruined aristocrats groveling on the cold marble floor. The suffocating grip of her past vulnerabilities, the endless days of exhausting corporate survival, and the agonizing fear of being an unprotected target all dissolved seamlessly into the absolute, unyielding fortress of Vittorio's embrace. She was no longer the broken woman they had cornered. Wrapped safely in the heavy wool of his coat and her own ivory cashmere shawl, her hand resting over her grandmother's modest amethyst pendant, she felt the ultimate protection of a king. Without another word, Vittorio commanded the room to step aside, lifting his pregnant fiancée completely off the ground. He carried her out of the ballroom, walking past the terrified elites and heading straight toward the idling, armored Maybach waiting in the freezing rain. She looked at the ashes of her old life and finally exhaled. The ultimate revenge was seizing everything from those who sought to destroy you. Do you think Cassandra and Marcus got what they deserved, or should Vittorio have gone further? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of absolute power. The freezing autumn wind rushed through the violently splintered oak doors, slicing through the heavy, perfume-laden atmosphere of the Palazzo d'Oro. Vittorio's bespoke leather boots struck the pristine white marble with a slow, deliberate rhythm, carrying the exhausted weight of his pregnant fiancée. But the syndicate king did not step out into the storm just yet. A few feet from the threshold, he stopped, turning his cold, calculating gaze back toward the paralyzed aristocrats. Elena kept her face tucked against the protective wool of his dark overcoat, her trembling fingers gripping his lapel. The agonizing cramps in her lower back had completely dissolved, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. She could hear the terrifyingly steady rhythm of his heart beneath the bespoke tailoring, a biological metronome of pure, unyielding dominance that anchored her hyper-vigilant mind. "Leo," the Don murmured. The loyal captain did not hesitate. With a sharp hand gesture, a dozen heavily armed operatives racked the slides of their tactical rifles in chilling unison. The metallic clatter echoed off the gold-leaf ceilings, causing several high society guests to flinch and spill vintage champagne over their trembling hands. "This empire operates on a singular foundation of respect," Vittorio declared, his baritone devoid of mercy. "For decades, you have hidden behind your inherited wealth and arrogant bloodlines, believing your elite status made you untouchable. Tonight, you learned your existence depends entirely on my restraint." He adjusted his hold on Elena, his right hand resting gently over the distinct curve of her 6-month abdomen. The heavy platinum and black onyx signet ring on his finger caught the fractured light, a silent, absolute symbol of territorial claim. "Nobody can hurt my queen," he continued, the liquid nitrogen chill in his tone freezing the blood of every billionaire in the room. "The woman in my arms is the sole architect of my future. Her word is my word. Her enemies are dead men walking." The silence in the ballroom grew so dense it felt like physical pressure. "Kneel," Vittorio commanded. It was an absolute, non-negotiable execution order wrapped in a single syllable. "Drop to your knees and show proper deference to your empress. Anyone left standing in 3 seconds will be permanently banished. You will leave this city with nothing." For a fraction of a second, aristocratic pride hesitated. Then, a prominent shipping magnate lowered himself to the unforgiving marble. The dam broke. Like cascading dominoes, the elite crowd physically dropped to the floor. The rustle of expensive silk was followed by the sharp, humiliating thud of kneecaps striking stone. Men who controlled billion-dollar hedge funds and women dripping in heirloom diamonds bowed in terrified submission. The sheer visual impact of 100 aristocrats kneeling before a former financial auditor from the working class was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Elena opened her eyes. The toxic hierarchy that had mocked her simple emerald dress and modest amethyst pendant was entirely dismantled. They were broken. Vittorio had rewritten the underworld's entire social order to place her at its absolute apex. Without waiting for a forced apology, the Don carried his fiancée through the shattered doorway, stepping directly into the freezing autumn storm. The harsh rain lashed against the exterior stone, but Vittorio's broad frame completely shielded her. At the base of the grand staircase, 50 blacked-out SUVs formed an impenetrable perimeter, their engines idling with a low, predatory growl. Leo swiftly opened the ballistic steel door of the custom Maybach. Vittorio slid into the expansive rear cabin, settling the exhausted woman onto the plush leather before pulling her back across his lap. The heavy door slammed shut, severing the chaotic noise of the storm. The climate-controlled cabin enveloped them, smelling faintly of rich leather and crisp ozone. As the motorcade accelerated with seamless tactical precision, Elena's adrenaline crashed. She shivered violently, a delayed somatic reaction to the sheer terror she had endured. "Turn the ambient heat up," Vittorio ordered the driver. His lethal edge was replaced by raw, immediate desperation. He peeled off his own heavy wool coat, wrapping it tightly around her shivering shoulders, over her ivory cashmere shawl. His massive hands framed her pale face, his thumbs gently tracing her drying tear tracks. "Are you in pain?" Did the cramping return? "No," she whispered, leaning her forehead against his jaw. Her analytical mind recognized the terrifying vulnerability in his dark eyes. The untouchable king was pale with the biological panic of almost losing his family. "I am okay, Vittorio. You got to me in time. I will never be late again," he vowed, his voice a rough whisper. He pressed his lips against her temple. "I will burn this entire world to ash before I let anyone look at you with disrespect." Within 20 minutes, the motorcade descended into the subterranean garage of their private stronghold. Vittorio lifted her easily, carrying her past biometric checkpoints and into the high-speed elevator. When the steel doors parted, they stepped into a sprawling sanctuary of quiet, indestructible luxury. Dark mahogany floors gleamed under amber lighting, and a massive stone fireplace crackled, casting a deep, radiating warmth. He set her down on the plush sofa with agonizing care. Elena was not a porcelain doll. She had stood her ground against a pack of wolves, using her own unyielding intellect. She just needed a place to finally rest her armor. Vittorio retrieved a thick cashmere blanket, draping it over her emerald dress. Then, the most feared man in the city did something that would have paralyzed his enemies with shock. He dropped to his knees on the dark wood floor. It was a quiet mirror to the forced submission at the gala, born of absolute, primal devotion. He slid his scarred hands under the warm cashmere, resting his broad palms against the swollen curve of her belly. Suddenly, a sharp, distinct flutter pressed against the inside of her stomach, bumping right against his palm. Vittorio's breath hitched. His lethal coldness was entirely replaced by overwhelming awe. Elena smiled, a genuine expression of pure relief, and wove her fingers through his dark hair. "They know you are here," she whispered softly. "They know their father chased the monsters away." He pressed a reverent kiss against her abdomen, swearing a silent oath of protection. "This is our sanctuary," Vittorio murmured, resting his cheek against her belly. "No lies, no politics, no threats. Just you, me, and our future. I promise you absolute peace, my queen." The heavy, suffocating burdens of her past financial struggles had finally been extinguished. She accepted the quiet warmth of his embrace, not as a symbol of surrender, but as a permanent pact of steel. The empire was finally secure. If you loved witnessing this tale of absolute karma and the undeniable power of a ruthless protector, do you think the elite crowd learned their lesson? Let us know in the comments below, and tap the subscribe button to never miss the next chapter of their sovereign reign.